My name is Harper Lane. I'm 27 years old, and for most of my life, I believed the oldest lie in my family. If I stayed quiet long enough, eventually I'd be treated like I belonged. Last Mother's Day, my mother sent me a bill for 219,684.17. Not a metaphor, not a joke. A real itemized invoice with line items for diapers, school supplies, piano lessons I never wanted, and the emotional labor of raising a difficult child. She didn't send it privately. She put every relative she could find on it. 56 email addresses, from my father's cousins in Arizona to my mother's aunt in New Jersey. The subject line read, Invoice, raising you. She expected me to break. She expected a public apology and a familiar performance. Me shrinking, her glowing, the room pretending it wasn't cruel. Instead, I replied, all with one attachment and one sentence. Since we're sharing numbers, here are mine. By sunrise, most of my family had blocked her. The ones who didn't block her stopped answering. And the one person who stayed, my grandmother, did something far more permanent than a block button. She rewrote the rules of our family in ink. I didn't plan to turn Mother's Day into a forensic audit of my childhood. I planned to survive another holiday. I planned to show up, chop vegetables, wash dishes, stay out of photos, and drive back to Chicago with my chest tight and my hands steady on the wheel, pretending it didn't hurt. I didn't know my mother had been saving her own surprise. I didn't know she had been counting on the same old version of me. Chicago makes sense to me. It's loud, busy, indifferent in a way that feels fair. I work in risk and compliance for a regional bank. Glamorous on paper, mostly spreadsheets and policies in real life. I live in a one-bedroom in Rogers Park with a view of an alley and a sliver of lake if I lean the right way. I pay my own rent. I paid off my credit card debt the hard way. I build my life the way I build my models, assumption by assumption, with proof. My brother Logan lives in Charlotte. He's 30, charming, a natural at being liked. He sells software to companies that don't need it, wears expensive sneakers, and calls our mother every day. He also bought a townhouse last year with a down payment that magically appeared the week he proposed to his girlfriend. My mother called it a family gift. I heard about it when Logan posted a photo with a caption about blessings and hard work, and my aunt commented a row of heart emojis. When I graduated from college, my mother sent a text message 3 weeks late. No emoji, no exclamation point, just proud. Keep it up. I held on to that word like it meant what it should. My father, Caleb Lane, isn't a villain. He's the kind of man who believes that if you don't raise your voice, a storm will pass you by. He builds fences, he mows lawns, he keeps receipts in a shoebox. He smiles when he's uncomfortable. When I was a kid, he used to squeeze my shoulder after my mother's sharper moments, as if a small gesture could fix a large wound. My mother, Dana Lane, is the weather. She's the sun when she wants you warm. She's the frost when she wants you brittle. She ran our house like a stage, with herself as the lead and everyone else as supporting cast. Logan was her proof that she did everything right. I was the prop that made her sacrifices look heroic. The older I got, the more the pattern turned into math I couldn't ignore. If Logan succeeded, it was destiny. If I succeeded, it was expected. If Logan failed, it was someone else's fault. If I failed, it was my character. There's a family story about me at 8 years old. At a cookout, I asked why my cousin got to refill his plate first. It was a real question. I was hungry and curious and loud. My mother still tells it as proof that I've always had an attitude. Logan, in that story, is always the sweet one who offered me his corn on the cob. I used to try to earn my way out of my role. Straight A's, sports, clubs. I tried being funny, being helpful, being invisible. Nothing changed. The thing about roles in a family like mine is that they aren't assigned based on who you are. They're assigned based on what someone else needs. The first time I realized numbers could contradict my mother's version of reality, I was 22 and applying for my first apartment after graduation. I had a job offer in Chicago, a letter of employment, and a small savings account. I expected the hardest part to be finding a place that wasn't a shoebox. Instead, the leasing agent frowned at her screen and asked if there had been a mistake. My credit score was 518. It felt like being accused of a crime I didn't know existed. I pulled my own credit report that night and stared at the screen until my eyes burned. 3 credit cards I'd never opened, a store card from a boutique in Charlotte, a maxed out department store card, a charge card with an annual fee that screamed luxury, all opened when I was in college, all delinquent at some point, all tied to my name and social security number. It didn't look like an accident. It looked like someone had used my identity like a spare key. I called my mother because, like an idiot, I thought the truth would make her protective. I thought she'd be outraged for me. I thought she'd mother me. The response landed like a slap wrapped in velvet. I must have been careless. Maybe I clicked on something. Maybe I didn't understand credit. The tone wasn't concern. It was annoyance. It was an insinuation that whatever happened was, in the end, my fault. I didn't argue. I didn't accuse. I took screenshots. I downloaded the reports. I started a folder on my laptop and named it something boring. Homework. Later, when I realized the folder contained evidence of crimes, I renamed it Receipts. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. Families don't steal from their kids. Mothers don't open credit cards in their daughter's name. That kind of thing happens to other people in documentaries. Then the IRS letter arrived. It wasn't dramatic, just an official envelope with polite language about a discrepancy. Someone had claimed me as a dependent for a year. I wasn't a dependent. The letter used the word under review, and I felt a new kind of fear. The kind that comes from realizing a system doesn't care that you're innocent if the paperwork says otherwise. I spent a weekend gathering pay stubs, lease agreements, bank statements, and a timeline of my life. I called the IRS and listened to hold music until the sun went down. I learned that someone had filed a return using my social security number and claimed credits tied to education expenses, even though I had paid those expenses myself. The representative's voice was neutral. The advice was practical. File an identity theft affidavit. Lock your credit. Keep records. So I did. I locked my credit. I froze my reports. I started keeping records the way my job taught me: date, source, document, corroboration. And I started looking backward. My grandparents had set up college funds for both Logan and me when we were little. I remembered the conversations, the way my grandfather would ruffle my hair and talk about options, the way my grandmother would smile like my future was something she could protect. Logan graduated without loans. I graduated with $41,000 in debt and a part-time job that I worked between classes. When I had asked about it at 19, my mother had explained that my fund ran out faster because of extra help I needed in high school: tutoring, camps, support. I had believed her because believing your mother feels like oxygen when you're young. At 24, I requested the statements. It took 3 phone calls and a notarized form because the account was old and managed through a custodian. When the envelope arrived, I opened it at my kitchen table with my hands shaking, and the numbers did what numbers always do. They told the truth. There had been $76,000 in the account when I turned 18. Over the next 9 months, it was withdrawn in 3 large chunks. The withdrawals weren't paid to a university. They weren't paid to a landlord. They were transferred to a personal checking account in my mother's name. A week after the largest withdrawal, my mother posted a photo on Facebook of a kitchen renovation: white quartz countertops, pendant lights, a caption about finally treating herself after years of sacrifice. I remembered liking the photo because I didn't want to be the kind of daughter who resented her mother's happiness. That was the moment my folder became something else. It stopped being homework and became a contingency plan. Not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted reality. I wanted to know whether I was crazy or whether my life had been quietly sabotaged by the people who smiled at my birthdays. 3 years of collecting doesn't mean 3 years of plotting. Most of the time, it meant 3 years of waking up and choosing peace anyway. It meant paying my bills, calling my father on Sundays, and showing up to holidays, because a part of me still hoped my mother would look at me the way she looked at Logan. Then came the Mother's Day reunion. 2 weeks before the holiday, my mother announced it in our extended family group chat. A big gathering at my grandmother Mabel's lake house in Michigan. The kind of place with a dock and a fireplace and generations of framed photos on the walls. The message had the right mix of nostalgia and authority. It had been too long. Everyone needed to come. This would mean so much to Grandma. The date was set. The head count was demanded. The tone implied that refusal would be a moral failure. Logan followed with a message full of enthusiasm and emojis. My mother reacted to his message with heart emojis. She reacted to my "I'll be there" with a thumbs up. My boyfriend Jonah asked why I was going. Jonah is 29, a public school counselor, and he has the kind of steady kindness that makes my mother's chaos look even uglier by comparison. He watched me pack a weekend bag and asked gently whether I wanted to do this to myself. I didn't have a neat answer. I had a complicated one. Part of me wanted my grandmother. Part of me wanted my father. Part of me wanted a clean ending to a story that had been messy for too long. And part of me, the smallest and most stubborn part, wanted my mother to finally be proud. I drove from Chicago to Michigan the day before the reunion. 8 hours of highway, podcasts, and the kind of mental rehearsals you do when you're walking into a room where you've been hurt before. When I pulled into the gravel drive, my grandmother's house looked the same as always. Blue shutters, wind chimes, a yard that sloped toward the water. The smell of pine hit me, and with it came a memory of being small and safe, sitting at the edge of the dock with my grandmother's hand around my wrist. I arrived early because my mother always had a way of turning help into obligation. In her world, Logan's presence was a gift. Mine was a utility. By 7 a.m., I was chopping onions, wiping counters, arranging chairs, and setting out place cards for 56 people. My mother moved through the kitchen like a director. The roast needed to be checked. The table needed to be longer. The flowers needed to face outward. When my grandmother shuffled in, my mother steered her back toward the living room with a bright smile and a tight grip, like she was managing optics as much as she was managing people. Logan arrived at noon in a rented SUV with his fiancée, Sienna, and a gift basket that looked expensive and impersonal. My mother greeted him like he was a returning hero. She hugged him twice. She smoothed his hair. She kissed Sienna's cheek and called her sweetheart. She looked past me the way you look past a chair. My father arrived with a cooler of drinks and the same tired smile he always carried into family gatherings. He hugged me and held on a second longer than usual. It felt like an apology he didn't have words for. By early afternoon, the house was full. Laughter bounced off the walls. Kids ran down the hallway. Plates clinked. People compared travel stories and weight loss and job promotions. My mother floated through it all, collecting compliments like currency. The meal was good. My grandmother's lake fish, my mother's roast, salads and sides. I ate mechanically and watched my mother watch the room. There was a brightness in her eyes that didn't match the occasion. It was the brightness of anticipation. After dessert, the toasts began. An uncle praised my grandmother. An aunt praised motherhood. A cousin praised strong women. My mother waited, letting the room warm itself up for her final act. When she stood, the room settled the way it settles when someone has taught everyone to give them the floor. She lifted her glass, smiled widely, and began with a story about sacrifice. The sleepless nights, the meals she skipped, the dreams she postponed. People nodded because that's what people do when a mother performs martyrdom. Then my mother moved to her favorite part, contrast. 2 children, 2 paths, one who made her proud, one who challenged her. Eyes turned. Heat moved across my skin. My mother's smile thinned, and she reached for her phone like a magician about to reveal the trick. An email notification sound chimed around the room. Then another, then a chorus. 56 phones lighting up, 56 people glancing down at screens, 56 expressions shifting from curiosity to discomfort. The subject line on their screens was unmistakable. Invoice, Raising Harper. The attachment was a spreadsheet. My mother had itemized my life. Birth hospital costs, daycare, clothes, therapy for attitude, extra support, lost opportunities. It ended with a total and a note about how she'd never been repaid for her suffering. And then she did the cruelest part in the most theatrical way. She read selected line items out loud, like she was delivering a punchline. The room laughed in the wrong places because people laugh when they don't know what else to do. I stood near the kitchen doorway, the same spot I had stood at every gathering where my mother needed an audience and I needed a corner. I could feel my father's gaze flicking to me. I could feel my brother's smirk. I could feel my grandmother's eyes on my profile, steady and sharp. My mother finished her toast by placing a framed printout of the invoice on the mantel near the family photos. She called it a reminder. She called it accountability. She called it love, as if cruelty could be renamed. The room waited. It waited for tears. It waited for an apology. It waited for me to prove my mother right by collapsing. Instead, my hand went to my phone, not in panic, in practice. I opened the folder that had been waiting for a day like this. Receipts. My mother had made one mistake. She had turned this into a group event. She had created witnesses. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue about feelings. I didn't beg for dignity. I gave them documents. One email, reply all. Subject line, statement of account. Attachments, 3 PDFs and 1 screenshot. Message body, since we're sharing costs, please review the following. Then I pressed send. The room filled again with notification sounds, but this time the sound wasn't a drum roll for my humiliation. It was the sound of my mother's control cracking. People opened my email with the same reflex they had opened hers. At first their faces showed confusion. Then the confusion began turning into something else. Shock, anger, calculation. The air changed. The temperature of the room shifted by degrees you could feel. The first attachment was a statement from the college fund. It showed the balance, the dates, the withdrawals. It showed the destination account with my mother's name. It showed, in black and white, that the money meant for my education had been moved out before a single tuition bill was paid. The second attachment was an IRS transcript. It wasn't sensational, it was bureaucratic. It showed my social security number listed as a dependent. For years, I lived in another state, paid my own rent, and worked full-time. It showed education credits claimed under my name, while my student loans accumulated interest. It showed the difference between my life and my mother's version of it. The third attachment was a summary of my credit disputes. The accounts opened, the addresses used, the shipping confirmations. It included a map of where packages had been delivered. One address highlighted in yellow belonged to Logan. I watched faces turn toward my brother. Logan's smile faltered. Sienna's hand moved unconsciously to the ring on her finger. My mother tried to speak over the reaction with a bright, brittle laugh. Mistakes happen, misunderstandings. This wasn't the time. But the room was no longer listening to her performance. The room was reading. An uncle who worked in accounting asked how a 529 withdrawal could be justified as family expenses. A cousin asked how a dependent claim could be legal. Someone asked why the credit card statements showed designer purchases shipped to Logan's townhouse. Someone asked why my mother had framed a bill for me while quietly stealing from me for years. My father stood up slowly, the way a man stands when his body makes the decision before his mind catches up. His face looked gray, like he had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. His hands gripped the back of a chair. My mother turned toward him and reached for his arm, as if she could anchor him back into her narrative. She used the same words she always used when control slipped: family, misunderstanding, loyalty. My father didn't move toward her. His eyes moved toward me, then toward the documents on his phone, then toward my mother. For the first time, his expression wasn't discomfort. It was recognition. Logan tried to laugh it off. There were excuses ready. Maybe Harper forgot, maybe Mom handled it, maybe it was complicated. But numbers don't care about excuses. Dates don't bend to charm. My grandmother Mabel didn't speak at first. She simply watched, letting my mother's voice lose power as the room's attention drifted away from her and toward the evidence. When my mother tried to redirect the room with tears, My grandmother's gaze stayed dry and sharp. My mother's next move was predictable. When sympathy doesn't work, fear does. She stepped toward me, too close, her smile gone, her voice low enough that it could be denied if anyone asked. There were things I didn't want out in the open. I didn't know everything. I should be careful. In another life, those words would have hooked into my ribs like barbed wire. In another life, I would have panicked, worried there was something wrong with me that she could expose. In this life, I had a fourth attachment. I had saved it for 3 years because it wasn't about money. It was about why. I attached it in that email for one reason. My mother had made this public, and she had earned a public truth. The screenshot was from a message thread between my mother and her sister, dated years ago, time-stamped, with my mother's words clear. It didn't talk about me being difficult. It didn't talk about my attitude. It didn't talk about sacrifice. It talked about Logan. It read, "If Caleb ever finds out Logan isn't his, the marriage is over and we lose everything. Keep this between us. Caleb can never know." I didn't need to narrate it. The room read it. My father read it. My brother read it. My mother read the way faces changed as people scrolled. The silence that followed was the kind of silence you feel in your teeth. My father's mouth opened once, then closed. His eyes didn't go to Logan. They went to my mother. My mother's face drained of color. The performance was gone. The mask dropped enough to show what had been underneath all along: calculation and fear. Logan's face changed, too. Not the smugness from earlier, something like disbelief, then anger, then a strange grief. Whether he had known or not, it didn't matter in that moment. The ground shifted for everyone. Sienna's expression turned sharp. Her hand stopped touching her ring and dropped to her side. My grandmother's chair scraped against the floor as she stood. My mother tried to speak, but the words collapsed. There was no version of this that sounded noble. There was no way to call this love. My father walked toward the front door. Not fast, not dramatic, just a man moving out of a room that had become unrecognizable. My mother called after him. His name cracked into the air like glass. He didn't look back. I followed him outside because the air inside the house had become too thick to breathe. The lake wind hit my face, cold and clean. My father stood near his car, one hand on the roof, staring at the water like it might explain something. I didn't know what to say. I had detonated a truth, and it wasn't just my mother's world that had blown apart. It was his. My father turned to me, and something in his face softened through the shock. The first words out of him weren't about biology. They weren't about betrayal. They were about me. "I'm sorry you carried this alone." My throat tightened. I had spent years waiting for him to see what was happening. I had spent years convincing myself that his silence meant agreement. In that moment, I saw something else: fear, avoidance. A man who didn't know how to protect his daughter from his wife and so protected himself instead. My father's voice shook. 27 years. Every school play, every scraped knee, every late night call from college. None of that was pretend. Nothing about you has ever been pretend. I didn't answer with anything clever. I just nodded, because my body was busy catching up to the fact that he was choosing me out loud. Inside the house, voices rose. Doors opened and shut. The family had split into camps. Those confronting my mother, those trying to calm Logan, those drifting away with discomfort and gossip. The beautiful Mother's Day reunion had turned into what it always was underneath: a reckoning. I went back in because I didn't want my grandmother alone in it. My mother sat on the couch with her hands clenched, eyes darting between faces. She looked smaller, not in an innocent way, but in the way a person looks when their power evaporates. My uncle demanded explanations. My aunt demanded an apology. Logan demanded to know if it was true. My mother tried to do what she always did: rewrite the story in real time. She was young. She was scared. She protected her family. She sacrificed. She did what she had to do. My grandmother stepped forward and ended the spin with one sentence: "You didn't protect this family. You protected yourself. Then my grandmother turned to me and placed a hand on my shoulder, firm and warm. The gesture felt like a seal. That night, I drove to a motel because staying in the lake house felt impossible. Jonah had already offered to come, but I asked him to wait. I needed to stand in my own aftermath without anyone else holding it for me. My phone lit up for hours. Messages from cousins, from aunts, from people who had watched my mother cut me down for years and had never interrupted the pattern. Apologies arrived late. Some felt real. Some felt like self-protection. I read them all anyway because I needed to know who was still there when the story changed. Logan sent one message that night. It wasn't an apology. It was a question. Did you know? I stared at it for a long time. I knew the documents. I knew the lie. I didn't know what Logan knew, and I didn't have the energy to untangle his guilt from his shock. I typed back. I knew my money was gone. I knew my identity was used. I found the message 3 years ago. Everything else is new to me, too. He didn't reply. The next morning, my grandmother called. Her voice was calm, almost gentle, which scared me more than anger. She asked me to come to her study at the lake house, alone. When I arrived, the house felt hollow. The relatives had mostly left. The kitchen was half cleaned. The framed invoice was gone from the mantel. My mother's car was still in the drive, but the curtains in the guest room were drawn like a closed eye. My grandmother sat behind an old wooden desk with an attorney beside her. Not my mother's attorney. Not the family attorney who had always spoken directly to my mother. This attorney wore a gray suit and a neutral expression, and he placed documents in front of my grandmother, like he was handling something fragile. My grandmother didn't waste time on comfort. She didn't need to. Her comfort came in actions. She explained that she had suspected for years that my mother's stories didn't match reality. She explained that she had quietly kept copies of documents just in case. She explained that the college funds had been designed to protect grandchildren from exactly this kind of parental misuse, and that she had trusted the wrong person as custodian. She also explained that she had made a phone call at 2 a.m. By morning, her will and trust had been amended. My mother's share reduced to the smallest amount that would prevent an easy contest. Logan's share placed into a restricted trust with distributions controlled by an independent trustee until he could prove he wasn't complicit in the fraud. My share increased, not as a reward for public drama, but as restitution for what had been stolen. Then my grandmother slid an envelope toward me. Inside was a check and a letter. The check was dated 4 years ago. My grandmother had written it for me when I graduated. The letter was in her handwriting, addressed to me, telling me that I deserved a future that belonged to me. The check had never reached me. My mother had intercepted it and told my grandmother I refused help because I was stubborn. The anger that rose in me wasn't explosive. It was cold, slow, and clean. My mother hadn't just stolen money. She had stolen relationships by controlling what people knew. My grandmother's voice softened only once. She admitted guilt for not looking harder sooner. She admitted that watching my mother perform motherhood had made everyone complicit because it was easier to applaud than to intervene. She promised one thing: it would not continue. I left her study with the envelope in my bag and a strange feeling in my chest. Not victory, not revenge, something closer to being seen. Later that afternoon, Logan found me outside by the dock. His eyes were red, his jaw was tight. He looked older than 30. He confessed the part that mattered most: the credit cards. He knew packages had arrived in my name. He knew my mother had used my identity. He didn't understand the full scale, he insisted, but he understood enough to keep enjoying the benefits. A ring, sneakers, a laptop, small luxuries that feel harmless when you're insulated by family loyalty. He also confessed that he had known for years the secret about his paternity. My mother had told him when he was 16 in a tearful midnight conversation about family and loyalty. She had framed it as a burden they carried together. She had made him her accomplice and called it love. Logan asked whether I hated him. The answer wasn't simple. I hated what he participated in. I hated the way he benefited from my damage. I also saw how my mother had trained him to protect her at any cost, including me. I told him the only truth I could manage. I didn't know what I felt yet, but I knew I was done protecting lies. That night, my father stayed at my uncle's house. My mother stayed at the lake house alone. Logan and Sienna drove back to Charlotte early. Sienna did not post about blessings. A week later, my father filed for separation. The paperwork arrived at my mother's door, like a consequence she couldn't laugh off. My mother called me from a number I didn't recognize because I had blocked her own. She left a voicemail that started with fury and ended with tears, and in the middle was the same refrain. "You ruined everything." I listened once, then I saved it into my folder, not because I wanted to hurt her, but because I had learned that in my family, proof was the only language that stuck. My work helped me do the rest. I worked with a consumer protection attorney to clean up what could be cleaned. I submitted identity theft affidavits. I filed amended returns. I documented every fraudulent account and every benefit my mother had gained. The consequences unfolded in slow motion. Credit bureaus updated. Letters arrived. Some debts fell off my record. Some remained until investigations closed. My mother's name surfaced in places she didn't expect. An inquiry from a tax agency, a request for documentation, a bank's fraud department asking questions she couldn't charm away. My family, the same family that had watched me stand in the back of photos for years, split into a new math. People who reached out, people who stayed silent, people who defended my mother because admitting the truth would mean admitting their own complicity. My grandmother became my anchor. She called every Wednesday at 7 p.m., not to gossip, but to ask if I had eaten, if I had slept, if I needed help. She didn't ask me to forgive. She didn't ask me to soften anything. She just held the line with me. Jonah held the other side. He made dinner when I forgot. He sat with me when I stared at spreadsheets like they were haunted. He reminded me that my worth wasn't a variable my mother could adjust. 2 months after Mother's Day, I received a letter forwarded from my father. It wasn't addressed to me, it was addressed to him. No return address, just a postmark from South Carolina. The letter was from a man named Adrian Cole. It was short and careful. It acknowledged the existence of a secret. It expressed regret for the past. It offered, in a restrained way, a willingness to provide information if needed for legal matters. It did not ask for forgiveness. My father read the letter, then looked at me with tired eyes. He didn't blame me. He didn't blame Logan. He blamed the person who had turned truth into leverage for decades. He told me that he would always be my father, regardless of what any test said. He told me that fatherhood wasn't a blood test. It was 1,000 ordinary choices. He told me that he had made those choices for me without hesitation. I believed him. And in believing him, I felt something inside me unclench for the first time in years. My mother tried one last time to reclaim the narrative. She showed up outside my office in Chicago on a Tuesday, dressed carefully, face composed, as if a neat outfit could erase fraud. She waited by the entrance like she had the right to my time. I didn't yell. I didn't create a scene. I walked past her and kept walking. When she followed, I stopped long enough to deliver a boundary with the same calm voice I used in meetings. No contact, no surprises, no workplace appearances. Any attempt to interfere with my employment or my finances would move our next conversation out of the family arena and into a legal one. I didn't threaten. I stated a consequence. She looked at me like she didn't recognize the person in front of her. For years, she had treated me as if I existed to absorb her shame. Now she was facing a version of me that refused to be a container. I got into my car and drove away. My hands were steady. The quiet felt like freedom. By late summer, my credit score climbed above 700. My student loan balance dropped. Jonah and I moved into a slightly larger apartment with a window that faced the lake for real, not just if I leaned. My father visited and brought a houseplant and a small toolbox. as if helping me build a life was something he could finally do out loud. Logan and I spoke twice, once to coordinate paperwork for the legal mess, once to talk like siblings for the first time without my mother's script running between us. Neither conversation was a miracle. Both were honest. Sometimes honesty is the only miracle available. My grandmother's new will didn't fix the past, but it did something important. It made it clear that cruelty would not be rewarded as tradition. She also established a small fund in my grandfather's name to help young adults untangle financial identity theft because she didn't want my story to be private shame. She wanted it to be protection for someone else. I used to think family meant endurance, staying, absorbing, forgiving, returning for more. I used to think boundaries were selfish. I used to think my mother's approval was the price of belonging. Then I watched my mother weaponize my life into a spreadsheet and hang it above a fireplace for applause. And I watched numbers cut through that applause like a knife. Here is the moral I carry now, and it's simple enough to fit on one line, but heavy enough to change a life. Love doesn't require you to be small. Real love doesn't need you to swallow theft or accept humiliation or carry someone else's secret shame like it's your job. If someone calls you difficult for wanting fairness, it usually means you've stopped being convenient. If someone calls you ungrateful for telling the truth, it usually means they were benefiting from your silence. And if your family only recognizes you when you're bleeding, that isn't family. It's an audience. My mother sent me an invoice for the cost of raising me. In return, I sent her the cost of lying to me. My bill wasn't paid in tears. It was paid in receipts, boundaries, and the quiet decision to build a life that doesn't require her permission. That's what I learned. You can't buy dignity back with apologies you didn't mean, but you can protect it with truth you're willing to stand in.